All right, that was awesome. Mr. P here, and we're going to continue this Chapter 1 lecture. And this is the last lecture in Chapter 1. Yesterday, or the last time you watched the lecture, we talked a little bit about the scientific method, and we talked about what is science, and we talked about what isn't science, and we also talked about what constitutes a theory and what constitutes a hypothesis, and how those are the same and how those are different. We also, at the end, talked about this idea of spontaneous generation and how two specific scientists, Francesco Redi and Louis Pasteur, how they both kind of did their own thing to help better our understanding of spontaneous generation and then ultimately disprove it. We now know that life doesn't just miraculously emerge from nothing. Okay, life requires a certain set of characteristics, and all living things exhibit the exact same characteristics, and all of them have to be there in order for a being or an object to be considered living. Okay, so let's discuss kind of a few of those. You saw in the video that some of those things, like the ability to move, might not be the only descriptor a living thing can have. Like it said, water moves all the time, clouds move, sand and rocks can move. All these things that are not living can move, and so we can't just say all living things can move, because there's a lot of non-living things that can move. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is this idea of cells, and I think you can't really talk about biology without talking about cells. Cells are the basic building block of life. Cells are the monomer of life, if you will. And all living things are composed of at least one cell. And I say at least one cell because there are living organisms that are made up of one cell. They live by themselves without any more than one cell. Okay, bacteria are an example. And then there's also single-celled eukaryotes like protists, euglena, paramecium, amoeba, stuff like that. Okay. All living things have to be made up of at least one cell. Many living things are made up of multiple cells, like humans. Okay, we have several trillion cells that make up us. A lot of living things, or most of the living things, have the ability to reproduce. You have to be able to reproduce. Reproduction is one of those things that really drives this idea of life. Okay, we already disproved spontaneous generation. We've already talked about how spontaneous generation was disproved. However, we haven't really talked about how life reproduces. I mean, you might have a fairly good idea of how that reproduction process takes place, but all living things have the ability to reproduce and must have the ability to reproduce, or the species as a whole is not going to survive. Okay, one organism has to produce another. In the case of binary fission, okay, if you're talking about bacteria cells, one will just clone itself, so to speak, and produce one more, or one will split into two. Okay, that's an asexual reproduction, but most living things, and mammals are no exception, is they follow the sexual reproduction, which requires a male and female to produce genetically different offspring. Okay, and we'll get to that later on in the year. One of the things that makes living things so unique is their heritable material. Okay, when we talk about heritable material, we're talking about DNA, we're talking about RNA, and we're talking about the sequence of nucleotides that really they're the building blocks for everything that's living. And the nice thing about life is there's only a set number of building blocks, just like there's a set number of words, but the number of sentences we can make and the number of combinations we can make from these words is vast, and really paves the way for the entire Earth and the entire biodiversity we see on this planet. Okay, but every living thing has to have some form of heritable material. Everything that's living has to be able to grow and develop. Okay, and grow and develop sounds the same, but they're quite different. Growing is just the ability to increase in size, while develop is the ability to mature, and they go hand in hand. Okay, everybody looks different now than when they were babies. Not only are you bigger and larger, and you're taller, and you weigh more, and you're thicker, and all these things that go along with growing has happened. Okay, you look different than you were when you were a baby. You have grown, you're bigger. Development comes along with growing, but development is just the maturing process. Okay, Develop is maturing, growing is just increasing in size. So all living things have the ability to grow and develop, as well as have cells, reproduce, have some form of heritable material. All living things also have a metabolism. I think you've probably heard a lot of people talking about metabolism, maybe around lunchtime. Okay, metabolism is your ability, or an organism's ability, to synthesize energy. Okay, there's certain processes like cellular respiration, photosynthesis. There's enzymes that play a role, but all of these kind of bioenergetic processes have to balance, and they have to be there in order for you to synthesize energy in the form of ATP from the food you eat. Okay, you eat food, your body and your metabolism produces ATP, which is the energy source that cells can use when you eat food. Okay, all living things have the ability to respond to their environment, and that could be as simple as sweating when you go outside when it's hot. Okay, when you go outside and it's hot, you respond to the environment by sweating. Okay, when it's cold, you respond by shivering. Now, sweating and shivering also play a role in maintaining homeostasis, which we'll talk about in a minute, but organisms have the ability to respond to their environment. Sunflowers will actually move from the east to the west following the sun. It's one of the reasons why they got their name sunflower. But they respond to their environment. Their enzymes are responding to the number of photons, or the amount of light that's hitting the receptors on their leaves, and actually will follow the sun. Okay, that's a response to the environment. That response allows them to live better because they're following the sun. They need the sun in order to produce glucose. And so if they can follow the sun, they're not going to lose or waste any of that precious sun photons. Maintaining homeostasis is that thing I just talked about. Okay, maintaining homeostasis. Homeostasis is a process that means, or is a word that means, maintaining a constant internal condition. Okay, it is not good for you if you lose a lot of water. Okay, we call that dehydration. It's not good for you to have a really high temperature. It's not good for you to have a really low temperature. Okay, everybody knows that if you are stranded outside, or if you play a sport and it's really hot, you've got to find shelter. You've got to drink water, because heat stroke is a real problem. Okay, why is heat stroke a problem? Because your core body temperature is increasing to an unsafe level, and when it increases to an unsafe level, you are not maintaining that balance, and your proteins and enzymes can actually start kind of pulling apart, and we call that denaturation, and we'll talk about it later in the year. But homeostasis is this really important balance that requires electrolyte balance. It requires pH balance. It requires H2O balance. It requires a certain water balance. It requires a temperature balance. There's all kinds of things that have to remain stable in your body all the time, and all living things have that same quality. Okay, all living things have the ability to evolve, and we're going to talk about evolution later in the year. But evolution is an organism's ability to change and adapt to its environment. Okay, it's fairly common knowledge now to know, or to understand, this idea of evolution. Organisms that were once alive, aka dinosaurs, right, are no longer living. Now, there was a big die-off, and there was a big mass extinction that could explain why these organisms are not on the planet, but one of the things that plays into that, or one of the pieces of evidence, or one of the pieces of data, if you will, is that organisms evolve, and it's very likely that some of the organisms that were alive when the dinosaurs were alive are, survived the mass die-off and have given rise to the organisms that are currently on the planet. Okay, we're not talking about evolution now, but we will later. Okay, all living things have the ability to evolve. All living things have the ability to maintain a constant internal condition. We call that homeostasis. All living things respond to their environment. All living things have a metabolism, meaning you eat food or produce your own energy, but there are bioenergetic processes that must happen in order to maintain a certain number of ATPs. Okay, all living things or all living organisms have the ability to grow and develop. All living things are made of cells. Remember, at least one cell. All living things have the ability to reproduce. And what is the material that allows you to be unique and what allows you to reproduce? It is your heritable material. Okay. Here are a couple pictures, and these just show you a couple examples of those concepts we've talked about. Okay. All living things have the ability to respond to their environment. Now, these plants are maybe viewed as being kind of a unique situation, right? They are not they're not consumers, so to speak. I mean, they do consume insects, but they are actually autotrophs. They're green. They produce their own food and glucose via photosynthesis, but they typically live in an environment that is very nutrient poor, and they adapted to that environment by consuming insects, which give them a lot of the trace minerals and the nutrients needed to survive and thrive. So this is a response to their environment. Their environment was very nutrient deficient, and they responded by producing a structure in this kind of mouth that allows them to take advantage of the nutrients where available, and they're available in insects. Okay? All living things have the ability to reproduce. You know what that means. It is producing babies of the same species. All living things then have the ability to grow and develop. Organisms don't stay baby forever. Okay? Organisms will grow and develop all the way through their lifetime. Organisms have the ability to process energy. Okay, we call that metabolism. Organisms have to consume, they have to eat, and they have to produce energy to power the cells. Organisms have a way of regulating body temperature and regulating those concepts I've talked about, like pH and salinity. Okay, we call that maintaining homeostasis. Why am I showing you a picture of a really big-eared rabbit? That's because in the desert, where these rabbits live, there's really no escaping the heat, and one of the things they have really adapted to, or one of the things that have allowed them to adapt to this hot environment, is really thin, large ears. And you can see these big blood vessels that run through them. They have quite a bit of their blood volume in these ears at one time, and because they're so thin, the heat that is kind of in the blood kind of transfers from the blood through the skin and then into the environment, and so it allows them to cool themselves off. Okay, dogs regulate their body temperature by panting. You've probably seen a dog pant when they're hot. Okay, they are expelling unneeded energy or unneeded heat from their internal core out their mouth and into the environment. Okay. These are a few examples. Evolutionary adaptation would be this idea of evolution and being able to change to better suit your environment. Okay, this seahorse looks identical to the reefs and the corals that they live in. Okay, that's an evolutionary adaptation. Showing you in more detail. Okay, there's the seahorse, and like I said, not only the color but the texture of the seahorse is identical or perfectly matched to its environment. Okay, how does it do that? Well, the ones that are closest to the environment are the ones that are going to be selected or favored in their environment. The ones that look least like their environment are the ones that are eaten the most. Okay, and if you're eaten, you can't reproduce, and if you can't reproduce, you don't pass your genes or your DNA on, and so your traits won't be selected for. Okay, all living things are made of cells. That's going to lead to the cell theory, which we're going to talk about in Chapter 7. But you can see this close-up micrograph image, and all these little tiny Lego-looking building blocks are all cells. And if you were to blow up a tissue or zoom in on a tissue that makes up you, that doesn't look much different than what you would look like. Okay, all living things are made of cells. All living things reproduce, and this shows you a picture of a fish, and it's kind of a weird looking picture because it's a head-on view of this fish, but this fish has eggs that it produced in its mouth, and while this is maybe disturbing, it's not eating its young, it's actually keeping them safe. Okay, and so not only did it reproduce, but it responded to its environment, which may be unsafe, by keeping the the baby fish in its mouth, which is going to allow more of them to survive and ultimately pass its genes on, or pass its DNA on to more offspring. Okay, this leads me into this idea of order in science and order in biology, and so if you look at these across the top, okay, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, it shows you how organisms are classified. And so if you look at the outermost level, this is domain Eukarya, okay, and you can see that name down here, domain Eukarya. Eukarya is the domain for eukaryotes, and eukaryotes are the cells that have a nucleus, okay, and so humans would be in this example, or in this domain. You can see a lot of mammals, but it's not just mammals. There's fish, there's frogs, there's reptiles, there's amphibians, there's cnidarians, there's annelids, there's fungus, there's angiosperms, all these things, including these little single-celled eukaryotes called protists. All of these things inhabit domain Eukarya. Okay? Then you go one step more specific, which is kingdom, and kingdom in this case would be Animalia, which means we're going to cut out all of the things that are not animals, which would be the plants, the fungus, and the protists. Okay? So once you're in Animalia, that would be the animals that we know of as animals. Then you go into phylum Chordata, okay, which would be the organisms with a backbone, okay, which is going to cut out your insects, it's going to cut out your sponges, it's going to cut out your starfish, and so these would be the chordates, or the organisms that have a backbone. Okay, it could still be fish, reptiles, birds, amphibians, or mammals. Then you go to class, which is even one step more specific, and this would be class Mammalia, and you can tell by that word that it probably means mammals. Okay, these are the mammals, and so we've cut out the fish, and we've cut out the birds, and we've cut out the frogs, and we've cut out the reptiles, and so we've only included mammals in this section. Order gets one more specific, and this would be Carnivora. Carnivora probably in your mind sounds like carnivore, and you would be right, and so these would just be meat eaters, which means we're going to cut out a lot of the hooved animals. We're going to cut out a lot of the organisms that don't eat meat. Okay, these would be your herbivores and stuff. And then we go one step further into family, and see how we're getting more specific as we go, and we're cutting out organisms because each organism is going to have its own order and stuff like that. But we get to family, which is Ursidae, and Ursidae is the bear family. Okay, every single thing in here would be bears. Then we get to genus, which is even more specific, and we're going to cut out kind of these more marsupial-like bears, and get into Ursus, which are basically the North American bears. Okay, once we go to genus, then we're going to go to specific species, and that's when you get to the specific species, in this case black bear. Okay, Ursus americanus is American black bear. Notice that a scientific name is made up of the genus, which is Ursus, and the species name, which is Americanus, which in this case would be Ursus americanus. Okay. Now, we talk about the organization within the biosphere, and the biosphere is a fancy scientific word for Earth. Okay, the biosphere is Earth. We can start all the way at the smallest unit, which is atoms, and you can actually break it down further. You can say atoms are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons, which we call subatomic particles. Okay, so subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons, make up atoms, and atoms make up matter. Okay, in this case, it's going to make up organelles. Atoms come together to make organelles. Organelles come together to make cells, and we know that cells are that basic unit of life from earlier. Okay, a couple slides ago, we said all living things are made of cells, and so these cells are going to be used over and over and over and over and over to make up a tissue. Tissues are going to make up organs, which are going to make up organ systems, which are going to make up organisms, which are going to make up populations of that organism, which are going to make up communities, which are different populations of different organisms. But again, in this case, we're only talking about biotic factors, okay? Those things that are living, like a population of deer interacting with a population of oak trees, which is interacting with a population of bunny rabbits. which is interacting with a population of hawks. Okay, and then we get to ecosystem, which is all of these individual communities that are now interacting with the abiotic factors, and we call those abiotic factors because they're non-living. Okay, when the non-living organisms or the non-living things interact with the living communities, it makes up an ecosystem. And so you're thinking, what are non-living things that interact with living things? Well, air is not living, water is not living, soil is not living, and these things are vital in maintaining order within our community and within our globe. Okay, and so when you put together all of your living and non-living components into one area, that's called an ecosystem. And you know from your middle school science that ecosystems make up the earth. Okay, you've got marine ecosystems, you've got terrestrial ecosystems, you've got oceanic ecosystems, and you've got deserts and rainforests, and all those biomes that you've probably learned about over and over make up Earth. Okay, so again, subatomic particles make up atoms, which make up organelles, which make up cells, which make up tissues, which make up organs, which make up organ systems, which make up organisms, which make up populations, which make up communities, which make up ecosystems, which make up the biosphere, and biosphere is the Earth. So, to wrap it up, what are unifying themes in biology? And this is the last slide we're going to have for Chapter 1. Okay, and so after this lecture, Chapter 1 should be done. Those unifying themes in biology that you're going to see over and over in this class is that all life is interdependent. What does that mean? It means that all life depends on every other form of life, and all life depends on all the non-living things that interact with those living things, like oxygen, carbon dioxide, sulfur. Okay, those things, water, carbon, all these things are non-living, but they're vital in the interdependency of life, which is biology. Matter and energy, and how matter and energy cycles through ecosystems and cycles through organisms. Cellular basis of life, again, all living things are made of cells, and cells are the basic unit of life. Heredity and information, which means DNA. All living things have DNA, and all living things have this heredity, which allows organisms to reproduce and eventually make more of that specific kind. Unity and diversity of life is organisms have some form of individuality, but they also have a lot of similarities among species. Okay, if you look at different individual cats, all cats have the same physiological makeup. They have the exact same shape. They have the exact same structures, like retractable claws. Okay, but there's a lot of diversity among cats. You have different patterns. Okay, some have stripes, some have a mane, some are really small, some are really large. And so while you have a lot of unity within one species of organism or one type of organism, there's still a lot of diversity among that life. Okay? Evolution. Organisms have the ability to evolve constantly. Evolution is constantly happening, and organisms have to have the ability to respond to their environment, adapt, and then evolve in order to ensure that that species lives on. Okay? And structure dictates function. This one is going to be extremely important for you as we go through this class. Okay? Structure dictates function. What does structure dictates function mean? It means that organisms have the ability to do something based on their structure. Shoes are structured to allow them to function properly on the foot or on the shape of object that is your foot. Okay? Shoes don't function very well when you put them on your hands. Just like gloves don't work very well when you put them on your feet. Okay? A staple remover is really good at functioning like a staple remover. It's really good about taking staples out. Okay? Why? Because it's structured to do so. A cup is structured to hold water or hold liquid. A strainer, which has the same basic shape, is not structured to function very good at holding liquids. Okay? It's structured to allow water and liquids to go through while keeping whatever was in the water within that bowl or contained within that. Okay, so structure dictates function. Structure is important, function is important, and structure has to dictate that function. Okay, not everything functions the same, which is really, really important. Okay, and last is this homeostasis process. And homeostasis, remember, is the ability for organisms to maintain a constant internal condition. Remember, you get cold and you shiver. Why? Because your body's trying to warm itself up. When you get hot, you sweat. Why? Because the body's trying to cool itself off. When you have a bacterial infection or a viral infection, your body's immune system actually turns up the thermostat and causes a fever. Why? Because those organisms, the virus or the bacteria, wants to keep a constant internal condition also, and by turning the heat up, you're essentially creating an environment that is not very conducive to bacterial surviving. Okay, and so the bacterial infection or the viral infection starts getting better. You just kind of have to suffer through a fever for a while. Okay, so I hope that that's clear. There's specific themes in biology that have to be kind of carried through every unit we talk about in this class from now until May. Okay, have a great weekend. We'll see you next week.